I stood between my daughter and the door of my lake house, and she looked at me with the polite impatience people reserve for waiters who forget the check. "Dad," Nora said, pushing a smile that didn't touch her eyes, "can we please not make this difficult? We're exhausted. We just drove 2 hours. I was a stranger on my own porch when my daughter told me to hand over the keys. Her suitcase wheels bumped up the cedar steps I planed myself. The same steps she'd wobble up as a kid with a popsicle dripping down her wrist. Now there was a white ribbon tied around the handle of a newer, sleeker suitcase, and a gold band on her hand that I had never been invited to witness. The lake behind me inhaled and exhaled in little glassy ripples, and the late July air in Evanston had followed us north like a hot breath. The man beside her, Grayson, was handsome in a way that photographs better than it lives. His jaw said magazine cover. His eyes said accounting software. Behind them, a second SUV door slammed. A woman in a linen blazer, his mother, Vivian, surveyed the house like a real estate agent deciding what to lowball. Her husband took the cooler out, set it on the gravel, and nodded past me like I wasn't there. "This is not complicated," Vivian told me, crisp as a receipt. "The young couple needs privacy for their honeymoon. You promised the house." "I promised?" I heard my own laugh, dry and thin. "Funny, I don't recall promising anything, because I don't recall being invited to any of this." Nora flinched, so slight you'd miss it if you didn't know her. But I knew. I knew the micro-expressions, the weather systems of her face. I knew the way she looked at me when she scraped her knee at 9, and the way she looked at me now, at 28, like a teacher asking a student to stop being disruptive. "Dad," she tried again, softer this time, "I told you we wanted a small ceremony. Nothing personal. We thought it would be best to avoid stress." "Whose stress?" I asked. "Yours? Or the man who taught you to swim in that water, who built that dock board by board, who kept this house warm through winters when the pipes screamed at 3 a.m.? Grayson stepped in, smiling like a customer service rep reading from a script. "Mr. Sullivan, we all respect your history here, but this is the first week of our marriage. Boundaries are healthy. We'll return the keys when we're done." He held out his hand, open, expectant, as if I were a concierge, as if my veins weren't threaded into the studs of this place. "Boundaries," I repeated, tasting the word. "You drew a boundary around your vows and left your father outside it." He chuckled. One syllable, condescending. "Let's not be dramatic." Vivian took a step forward, her perfume expensive and antiseptic. "Blake, I'm sure this is emotional for you, but making a scene won't change what's already happened. Nora has started a new family. This," she gestured to the house, the porch, the lake, "is the least you can do. The least I can do. After 30 years of early mornings and late invoices, after the lean years when I took extra shifts so Nora could have braces and ballet. After her mother and I split, and I'd drive across town on Tuesdays just to make mac and cheese and help with homework. After every late-night rescue when she called from some bar, and I kept my voice calm and said, "I'm on my way, kiddo. Don't move." The least I can do. I stared at my daughter. Her makeup was immaculate, her hair swept back into a bun that made her look older, more distant. She had always been good at putting herself together, but her shoe, white, satin, pretty, had a speck of gravel clinging to the side. Imperfect, human. "If you needed the house," I said evenly, "you could have asked me. You didn't have to have your mother-in-law do it." "I'm asking," Nora said, finally, and I heard something raw and buried in her voice. But then she swallowed it down and glanced at Grayson like a stage actor waiting for the next line to feed her. "Please." The word landed between us with all the wrong weight. Not a daughter's please, a customer's. Behind me, the screen door creaked, a familiar old complaint, and reminded me of every summer thunderstorm we'd watched from this porch, the two of us wrapped in the same blanket, counting the spaces between lightning and thunder. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, she used to giggle at 3, scared and thrilled. I bought her first fishing rod here. I taught her to respect the hooks, not fear them. We planted the hydrangeas together, knees in dirt. I showed her how to coax life from stubborn ground. Grayson tapped his watch. We've driven a long way. We have reservations for dinner. I looked past them. The sun had fallen behind a row of pines, turning everything gold. The kind of gold you can only earn by waiting through an entire day. A dragonfly stitched lazy loops over the water. Somewhere down shore, a radio murmured a baseball game. It was the kind of evening that forgives you. It didn't forgive me. I didn't get an invitation, I said to Nora. Not for the wedding, not for dinner, not for anything. But I'm invited to leave my own house? Silence opened, like a door no one wanted to touch. Vivian filled it. Blake, you know how you can be. It would have been complicated. This is for the best. For who? I asked. For everyone, she said. And the way she said everyone meant everyone except you. Nora stepped closer. For a second, she looked 12 again. Dad, I didn't want a fight. I just wanted a simple celebration. That's all. Please don't make me choose. I felt something split. Not dramatic, not cinematic. More like the quiet crack of ice shifting under steady pressure. Nora, I said, you already chose. Grayson sighed. This is getting us nowhere. Sir, if you don't hand over the keys, we'll have to involve law enforcement. We have a right to be here. Nora's name is on the Airbnb reservation. Vivian cleared her throat, startled. Grayson. I turned the keys in my palm. The metal was warm from my hand, from decades of holding, from countless summer arrivals, winter departures. It would have been so easy to throw them into the lake and watch them sink like an old promise. It would have been satisfying. But I learned a long time ago that the most dangerous man in the room is the one who knows how to wait. So I opened the door, stepped inside, and lifted the framed photo from the entryway table, the one of Nora at 10, grinning, a missing front tooth, holding up the lopsided trout we never ate, because she named it, and insisted we put it back. I slid the photo from the frame and into my shirt pocket. Then I walked to the kitchen, took the spare keys from the hook, and slipped them into my jeans. Insurance. Memory. When I returned to the porch, 3 faces watched me like weather. I pressed the main set of keys into Nora's hand. Treat the house like a living thing, I said. It remembers. She nodded. Relief flooding in and displacing something like shame. Thank you. Grayson ushered her past me with a proprietary touch at her back, then lifted the cooler as if he were doing me a favor. Vivian smiled the way people smile when a child finally complies. They filed into my foyer, tracking in lake dust and new perfume. I lingered on the porch, fingers on the scar in the rail where Nora had carved her initials with a butter knife one summer, BL+NS. The S later sanded out after a teenage breakup. I had left the scar on purpose. History shouldn't look brand new. It should look like what it survived. Blake? Vivian called over her shoulder. You'll want to give them space. The guest house should be comfortable enough for you. The guest house, I repeated, almost amused. That place was an old tool shed I renovated into a spare room when my brother used to visit. I had put the best mattress in the main bedroom for my daughter when she visited, when she was still mine. Grayson set the cooler on my kitchen counter. We'll need the Wi-Fi password. It's on the fridge, I said, under the magnet that says, be nice or leave. He smiled like he didn't understand the joke. I stepped down from the porch and walked the gravel path toward the guest house. The stones shifted under my boots. The sound reminded me of applause that wasn't for me. Halfway there, I stopped and turned back. Through the open door, I saw Nora pause at the framed map of the lake on the wall, the one with little pinholes where we'd marked all the best fishing coves. She touched one gently, like remembering could absolve her. Grayson tugged her on. I sat on the guest house bed, the springs too honest, and listened to the muffled thump of luggage, the drip of tap water, the bright chirp of a phone receiving a message. I pictured the table they'd set, the wine they'd open, the way they'd claim the best view without earning it. I thought about love, how it has a way of being loud when it arrives and quiet when it leaves, how it doesn't slam doors so much as stop coming in. I am not the slamming type. I am the type who takes notes. On the nightstand was a small notebook I keep for grocery lists and measurements. I flipped to a blank page and wrote today's date. Then I wrote one sentence. They married without me and asked for the keys. When I put the pen down, my hand was steady. Outside, the lake let out a soft sound, like a secret shared between old friends. I stood, went to the window, and watched the last light lose its argument with the trees. My reflection stared back. 66. Hair gone salt and pepper long before I was ready. Shoulders marked by years of lifting things no one else saw. People think a father's power is in what he can give. They forget the other side of the ledger. I pressed my palm flat to the glass and asked the question that would not stop humming. At what point does a father become a trespasser in the life he built? And what happens when the trespasser finally decides to knock? When Nora was born, the doctor placed her in my arms like a secret I wasn't sure I deserved. I remember the way her fingers curled around my thumb, impossibly small, and how I made a silent vow in that delivery room in Evanston. No matter what happened in my life, I'd make sure hers was better. I was 38, running a modest carpentry business out of a cramped workshop that smelled of sawdust and coffee gone cold. The lake house wasn't even a thought then, just a dream I'd mutter about over late-night beers with my brother. But holding her, I felt a purpose that made the long days and the low bids worth it. When her mother left 3 years later, citing different paths and emotional exhaustion, I became both parents overnight. Mornings were a blur of ponytails and scrambled eggs. Evenings were math homework at the kitchen table. The money was never plentiful, but Nora never felt the pinch. I picked up weekend work, refinishing old boats, and every dollar I didn't need went into a savings jar in the pantry. By the time she was 10, that jar had become a down payment on the lake house. I bought it not as an escape for me, but as a sanctuary for us. A place where the air felt cleaner and time moved slower, where she could be a kid without the noise of custody schedules and schoolyard politics. The first summer we spent there, Nora called it our kingdom. She'd wake me at sunrise, dragging me down to the dock to watch the mist burn off the water. She'd chatter about everything, school crushes, what she wanted for her birthday, whether ducks had best friends. I taught her how to fish, how to paddle without tipping, and how to listen for the sound of rain before it came. She loved the hydrangeas out front and would water them with a tiny metal can, insisting it made them happier than the hose. Grayson entered her life much later, when she was 24 and fresh out of grad school. She'd landed a marketing job in the city and met him at some networking event. At first, I was glad she had someone she seemed excited about, someone who made her laugh. But I noticed early on that his charm was surface deep. He had a habit of interrupting her stories to tell his own, and when he shook my hand for the first time, he didn't look me in the eye. He talked a lot about connections and leverage, words that made me think of stock tickers more than relationships. The first red flag came one autumn when I invited them to the lake house for a long weekend. I'd spent the better part of 2 days cleaning gutters, splitting firewood, and preparing her favorite stew. When they arrived, Grayson walked in like a man touring a property he might buy. He tapped on the counter to check the finish, suggested the living room could use more natural light, and asked, half joking I think, if I'd ever considered listing it on Airbnb for passive income. Though Nora laughed along with him, but there was a stiffness to it. The way you laugh when you're embarrassed for someone else. Later that night, as we sat by the fire, he told me, "You're sitting on an underutilized asset, Blake. A place like this could be making you money year-round." I told him it was already paying dividends. In memory, he smiled like I'd missed the point entirely. After that visit, I noticed small changes in Nora. She started calling less, texting in short bursts rather than long conversations. When she did visit, she'd bring Vivian and Charles, Grayson's parents, without much warning. They were polite enough on the surface, but there was a constant undercurrent of appraisal. Vivian would compliment the rustic charm of the house, then suggest more modern updates to make it appeal to younger tastes. Charles once asked, over dinner, whether I'd ever thought about downsizing now that I was getting older. They never said it outright, but I began to feel like they saw the lake house not as part of me, but as a prize waiting to be claimed. The biggest humiliation came 2 years ago, at Nora's birthday dinner. It was at a downtown restaurant, one of those places where the lighting is dim enough to hide the prices. I had saved up to cover the bill as a surprise. When the check came, I reached for it, but Grayson's hand landed on top of mine. "Don't worry, Blake," he said with a smile. "We've got it covered. You can get the tip." The table laughed, including Nora, and I swallowed the heat that rose in my face. When the waiter brought the bill back, Grayson slid it into his jacket pocket and said, "It's good to feel like the provider sometimes, isn't it?" I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just sensitive, that Nora was an adult building her own life. But the subtle manipulations kept coming. Invitations to events would get lost until the day before. Plans to visit the lake house would be relayed through Grayson rather than Nora. When I'd suggest a weekend together, she'd tell me they were already using the place with friends. The final nudge from unease into outright suspicion came 3 months before her wedding. Nora called one evening, her voice unusually formal. She told me they'd decided on a small, intimate ceremony, and that it would be simpler if I didn't attend. "It's nothing personal, Dad," she said. "It's just complicated." She never explained what was complicated, and I didn't ask. But when I saw photos later, posted online by a mutual acquaintance, it wasn't small at all. It was lavish, expensive, the kind of wedding where no expense is spared, except, apparently, for a chair with my name on it. In one picture, Grayson and Vivian stood beside Nora, all 3 of them smiling like the world was exactly as it should be. Behind them, on a projector screen, was a slideshow of memory, except every single one was from the last 4 years. No fishing trips, no lake sunrises, no evidence I'd ever existed before Grayson. I stared at those photos long after the screen went black. There was no anger at first, just a hollow quiet, like someone had siphoned the air from the room. It was the realization that they hadn't just cut me out of a wedding. They were rewriting the story. And then, weeks later, came the knock on my porch, the suitcases on the cedar steps, and the words, "We need the house." It was in that moment, watching my daughter stand beside a man who saw my life's work as a convenient backdrop, that I knew something was deeply wrong, not just with them, but with the way I had been letting them take, piece by piece, without ever asking what I might want in return. And as I sat in the guest house that night, listening to their laughter drift through the dark like it belonged there, I felt the first sharp edge of a plan take shape. Something was about to change. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, the kind where the lake wore its calmest face, and the air smelled faintly of pine and leftover charcoal from last night's cookouts. I'd been in the guest house for nearly a week, enduring the muffled sounds of Nora and Grayson's honeymoon upstairs in the main house. Doors slamming, ice clinking in glasses, the thump of music spilling from the porch. I told myself I'd wait them out. That was my mistake. Around 3 o'clock, a silver Lexus pulled up the gravel drive. Out stepped Vivian, crisp as a bank statement, trailed by Charles and a man in a navy blazer with a leather folio under his arm. His shoes didn't match this place. Too polished, too deliberate. They crossed the yard without hesitation, like the path was theirs. "Blake," Vivian began, her tone already carrying the weight of foregone conclusion. "This is Martin Caldwell, our attorney. He's here to clear up a little misunderstanding." I stepped out onto the guest house porch, squinting against the sun. "What misunderstanding?" Caldwell flipped open his folio and produced a sheaf of papers. You've been served notice that the primary residence on this property is no longer solely in your name. Ms. Sullivan?" He nodded toward Nora, who had emerged onto the main porch behind him, "is now a co-owner by recorded deed. Effective last month." My stomach dropped like an elevator cut loose. "That's impossible." "It's perfectly legal," Vivian cut in smoothly. "Remember the refinancing paperwork you signed 2 years ago? You added her for estate purposes. We simply finalized the process. This ensures the property remains in the family, her family." I stared at Nora. Her arms were folded tight across her chest, her mouth a thin line. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "This also means," Caldwell continued, "that you no longer have exclusive occupancy rights. Nora and her husband have chosen to exercise theirs, effective immediately. We ask that you vacate the premises within 72 hours. I laughed. A short, bitter sound. "You're evicting me from my own house?" "It's our house," Nora said quietly. And that was the knife. Not shouted, not thrown, just pressed in with steady hand. I thought it couldn't get worse until I heard the tires crunching up the drive. 2 Evanston police cruisers rolled in, lights off, engines rumbling. An officer stepped out, radio at his shoulder. "Mr. Sullivan?" "Yes." "Sir, we've been asked to issue a trespass warning. If you refuse to leave after the deadline, you'll be subject to arrest. We understand this is a civil matter, but the co-owner has made the request in writing." Behind the officer, Grayson was leaning against the porch rail like a man enjoying a front-row seat. Vivian's expression was that of a hostess overseeing a well-planned party. Charles busied himself unloading a case of wine from the Lexus. The neighbors started drifting out of their yards. A couple across the cove watched from their dock. The Miller boys, teenagers who used to beg me to take them tubing, paused mid-basketball game to gawk. It was public, final, and humiliating. I signed the officer's clipboard with a hand I willed not to shake. He tore off my copy and handed it over like a receipt. "Thank you for your cooperation, sir," he said, already turning away. As the cruisers left, Vivian clapped her hands lightly. "Well, that's settled. Nora, why don't you and Grayson show Martin the upstairs? We can talk about future renovations." I walked the gravel path back to the guest house. Halfway there, I realized my truck, parked out front, was gone. A scrap of paper fluttered against the guest house door frame. Towing notice. By request of co-owner, it read. The heat in my chest was sharp, but beneath it, something colder spread, steady, unshakable. I stepped inside, sat on the edge of the bed, and set the trespass warning on the nightstand next to my notebook. Outside, I heard laughter from the main house, glasses clinking, music starting up. I opened the notebook to the page with the single sentence I'd written days before. They married without me and asked for the keys. Underneath it, I added another line, slow and deliberate. Now they've taken the house. Then I closed it, set my pen down, and just sat there, listening to the sound of their celebration wash through the trees like it belonged here. My face didn't change. My hands were still. Because some decisions don't need to be announced. They only need to be kept. The morning after the police cruisers rolled away, I woke before sunrise. The lake was still, a sheet of glass catching the pale blush of dawn. From the guest house window, I could see the main house, my house, dark except for a single light in the upstairs bathroom. Nora's silhouette moved past it, head bent, hair loose. For a moment, she looked like my little girl again, the one who used to pad down to the dock in her pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Then the light went out, and the image dissolved. I brewed coffee in the old percolator, the one they hadn't thought to take, and sat with my notebook open. The first page held my 2 sentences. I stared at them until the letters blurred, then flipped to a fresh sheet. There was no grand plan yet, just threads, small pieces I could pull without them noticing, and I knew exactly where to start. Grayson prided himself on managing assets. I remembered that smug comment during our first meeting about turning the lake house into an Airbnb. He probably saw the honeymoon week as his test run. I also knew something he didn't. The property tax account was still set up to auto-draft from my personal bank, because I'd never bothered to change it after adding Nora's name to the deed. That was about to end. After breakfast, I drove into town. At the county clerk's office, I asked to see the most recent property record. The clerk, a woman with steel-gray hair and a habit of lowering her voice for gossip, slid it across the counter. Sure enough, Nora and I were listed as co-owners, but the mailing address for all tax correspondence was still mine. I'd like to change that, I told her, filling out the form in block letters. I listed Nora and Grayson's condo address in Chicago. And remove the auto-draft authorization, I added. We'll pay by mailed invoice from now on. She stamped it without a question. Next bill's due in 60 days, she said. Hope your daughter's on top of it. Late fees rack up fast. Me too, I said, folding the receipt into my pocket. From there, I made a second stop at the marina. The Sullivan Dock permit, renewed every spring for as long as I'd owned the place, was in my name. I transferred it to my brothers, a fisherman who lived 2 towns over. Just for a while, I told the harbor master. Family arrangement. That meant if Grayson wanted to use the dock for his precious pontoon rides, he'd have to call my brother for permission. And my brother, well, he's a busy man. When I returned to the guest house, they were on the porch eating breakfast. Vivian in a sun hat, Grayson in his designer sunglasses, Nora scrolling her phone. Morning, I said, tipping my coffee mug. Grayson didn't bother looking up. We're out of oat milk, he said, like it was my problem. I let that slide. By the way, I added casually, I stopped the auto-pay on the property taxes. You'll get the bill at your condo now, just a heads up. That made him pause mid-bite. Why would you do that? Estate purposes, I said, echoing Vivian's tone from the day before. You're co-owners now. Makes sense you handle your share of the responsibilities. He smirked like it didn't bother him, but I saw the flicker, a tiny shift behind his sunglasses. Money people don't like surprises they can't control. Over the next few days, I made myself scarce. I'd take the truck into town, chat with the locals, keep my ear to the ground. I knew half the shopkeepers from decades of business, and they didn't mind telling me what they thought of the city folks taking over. Word travels fast in a lakeside community, especially when you plant it yourself. I mentioned, casually, that the new co-owners were talking about modernizing the place, maybe even changing access to the shoreline. By the third retelling, it would sound like they were planning to fence off the public swim area. Sure enough, 2 mornings later, I watched from the guest house as Grayson stepped onto the porch and was greeted by old Mrs. Halloran from the next lot over. I couldn't hear her words, but I saw her wag her finger at him and turn away in a huff. He looked after her like she'd just spoken in another language. That night, the lights in the main house burned later than usual. Through the open guest house window, I caught fragments of their voices, low, tense. Vivian's clipped tone, Grayson's irritated mutter. Nora barely spoke at all. The next day, Grayson cornered me near the driveway. Listen, he said, his smile stretched thin. I don't know what you've been saying to the neighbors, but you're stirring up trouble. I tilted my head. Am I? Yes, he said, leaning in. Vivian had to smooth things over with 3 different families yesterday. That's not the kind of reputation we want here. I took a slow sip of coffee. Reputation's a funny thing, I said. Once it changes, it's hard to change back. He glared for a moment, then walked off without another word. It was a small win. Nothing flashy, just enough to shift the air. They were starting to feel the edges of something they couldn't quite name, and in that subtle discomfort, I felt the first real satisfaction I'd had in weeks. That evening, as the sun sank behind the pines, I sat on the guest house porch and watched the lake darken to ink. The cicadas started their chorus, and a heron skimmed the water like it knew exactly where it was going. I thought about all the years I'd spent here, building, fixing, protecting, and how easily they'd assumed they could take it from me. That's when I remembered. I still had something left. 3 mornings later, I woke to the crunch of tires in the drive again. Not the friendly, neighborly kind, but the sharp, decisive sound of people arriving with purpose. I stepped out of the guest house, coffee in hand, just as a black SUV pulled up. Out stepped Martin Caldwell, the same attorney from before, this time with a man I recognized from the county zoning office. Behind them trailed Grayson and Vivian, both looking far too pleased for people visiting a co-owner they were trying to push out. "Mr. Sullivan," Caldwell began, flipping open his folio, "we've reviewed the property boundary and discovered that the guest house, where you're currently staying, is situated on the main parcel listed under both owners' names. As such, the co-owners have the right to request exclusive occupancy of that building as well." "In other words," Grayson said, stepping forward, "you'll need to vacate the guest house by the end of the day. We've arranged for your belongings to be moved into town." "Into town," I repeated. "You mean that motel by the highway?" "It's temporary," Vivian said with a syrupy smile. "Just until we decide the best use for this space. You'll be more comfortable there." More comfortable. In a room with a rattling air conditioner, miles from the water. While they enjoyed the property I built into a home, I let the silence stretch, and that's when Caldwell delivered the extra twist. "Also," he said, "we've filed a petition to the court regarding the title. Given your age and certain lapses in property maintenance," he gestured toward the chipped paint on the guest house porch rail, "we're seeking to have Nora designated as the managing owner. This will give her final say over all use, repairs, and occupancy decisions." I almost laughed in his face. "You mean you're trying to cut me out of decisions entirely?" Grayson shrugged. "It's for efficiency. You've had a good run here, Blake. It's time to let the next generation take over." It was a clean play, cold, strategic, and designed to make me look like a stubborn old man standing in the way of progress. But they'd underestimated something. I didn't just own half the property. I owned something they didn't even know existed. While they preened on the porch, I thought back to 15 years ago, when the town announced it was auctioning off several small shoreline lots that had gone tax delinquent. One of them, just 300 feet down the shore from the lake house, had been little more than a tangle of brush and an old wooden dock sinking into the water. I bought it for $4,000, cleaned it up, rebuilt the dock, and used it as a private put-in spot for my kayak. It wasn't connected to the main parcel and had its own deed, its own address, its own utilities. I'd never told Nora about it. Not because I was hiding it, but because it was mine, in a way the lake house never fully could be, once her name went on the paperwork. And last year, after a long lunch with an old friend who worked in real estate law, I'd quietly placed that little lot into a trust. Not in my name, not in Nora's, in the name of Sullivan Shore LLC, a company I'd set up years ago for side carpentry jobs and never closed. That meant every dock permit for that lot, every slip rental, every fishing launch from it went through me. And that lot? It was the only legal water access point for the lake house once the town rezoned the shoreline last year to protect erosion. Without access through my lot, they'd have to haul boats in from the public launch 5 miles away. They didn't know that yet, so I let them talk. I let Caldwell finish his little speech about managing owners and responsible stewardship. Then I glanced toward the lake, where my dock, was catching the sunlight like a silver blade. "You've done your homework," I said finally, "but not all of it." Vivian tilted her head. "Meaning?" "I mean," I said slowly, "before you move my things into that motel, you might want to check who controls your lake access, because as of last year, this house doesn't have any. And without it, that dock you're so proud of is just decoration." Grayson frowned, the first real crack in his polished veneer. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" I asked. "Go ahead. Call the marina. Ask them about Sullivan Shore LLC." The zoning officer shifted uncomfortably. "If that's true," he said, "they'll need a shared access agreement to use the water, which means they'd need your signature, Mr. Sullivan." I let the silence hang heavy, watching the realization work its way across their faces. "That's extortion," Vivian. That's ownership, I corrected. The kind you didn't bother to look for before you tried to box me out. Grayson's jaw tightened. He was calculating now, trying to decide if this was a bluff. I could see the doubt flickering behind his eyes. We can still move forward with the petition, Caldwell said stiffly. You can try, I said, but I'll make sure every neighbor on this lake knows exactly who's behind it. And trust me, public opinion matters here more than you think. You saw how quickly it turned last week. For the first time since this began, they didn't have a neat, rehearsed answer. Caldwell muttered something about reviewing options and started gathering his papers. The zoning officer excused himself, clearly unwilling to stand in the middle of what was about to become a storm. Grayson stepped closer, lowering his voice. You think you've got the upper hand now, old man? This isn't over. I met his stare without blinking. You're right, I said. It's not. And as they walked back toward the house, I stayed rooted where I was, the lake glinting behind me like a co-conspirator. Because if they thought this was the end, they hadn't even seen the opening act. It happened 2 weeks later, on a Saturday bright enough to look innocent. The air was already warm by mid-morning, and I was back in town having breakfast at Pete's Diner, when I overheard 2 locals talking about a big barbecue happening at my place. That word, my, still burned every time I heard it in connection with them. I paid my bill, drove out toward the lake, and could hear the music before I even turned onto the gravel drive. There were cars lined up along the shoulder, fancy sedans and SUVs, city plates. As I walked up, I saw balloons tied to the porch rail, the lawn filled with guests in pastel summer clothes. Vivian stood by the grill directing 2 caterers, while Charles poured wine into crystal glasses. Grayson, in aviators and a linen shirt, was holding court near the dock, telling a story that had his little circle of friends laughing on cue. Nora was there too, in a pale blue sundress, smiling politely as a guest complimented the renovations. Taos, the hydrangeas we'd planted together, were blooming full and heavy, but they'd ripped out the weathered wooden bench beneath them, replacing it with something sleek and soulless. It was a party to show off their lake house, a declaration to the neighbors that the Sullivans were no longer part of the picture. I stepped onto the edge of the lawn. Heads turned, conversations dipped. Well, if it isn't the guest house squatter, Grayson called out, grinning like he'd just spotted the entertainment arriving. Come to see how it's done? A few guests chuckled, unsure whether they should. I came, I said evenly, to congratulate you on your last party here. That got their attention. Even the caterers paused. Vivian set down her wine glass. Blake, please, let's not cause a scene in front of our guests. This is exactly the place, I said, because I think your guests deserve to know the whole story. I walked forward slowly, feeling the hush ripple through the yard. 2 months ago, my daughter got married without inviting me. A week later, she showed up here, asked for the keys, and told me I'd be staying in the guest house. Then you, I nodded at Grayson, brought lawyers and cops to evict me from the property I built, and you all assumed I'd just slink away. A murmur ran through the guests. Nora's face had gone pale. Grayson's smirk was stiff now. But here's the thing, I continued. You forgot to do your homework. This house has no legal water access without a small piece of shoreline 300 feet down. That dock down there, I pointed toward my lot, visible from here, is the only private access point since the rezoning last year. And I own it outright. Not just me, Sullivan Shore LLC. Which means anyone who wants to use that dock, launch a boat, even fish from it, needs my written permission. I pulled a folded document from my jacket pocket and held it up. As of this morning, the town council has approved my request to revoke shared access rights from this property, effective immediately. The reaction was immediate. A sharp intake of breath from the crowd, whispers flaring like matches. Someone asked, "Wait, so they can't use the lake?" "That's right," I said, my eyes on Grayson. "This is now a very nice house with a very expensive view you can't touch." Vivian stepped forward, her composure cracking. "You can't do that." "I can," I said calmly. And I did. Grayson's jaw worked, but no sound came out. He looked at the guests, searching for an ally, but found only eyes darting away. The man thrived on image, and in this moment, it was crumbling. "I told you before," I said, my voice carrying across the lawn. "Reputation is a funny thing. Once it changes, it's hard to change back. And right now, every person here knows exactly what you tried to do to me." I turned to Nora. For the first time in weeks, she met my eyes. "You could have had all of this one day," I said quietly enough for only her to hear, "but you wanted it right now. And in taking it that way, you lost it." She blinked hard, but didn't answer. I stepped back, giving the moment room to breathe. The guests were no longer mingling. They were collecting handbags and car keys, muttering goodbyes. The music had gone silent. "This is trespassing now," Grayson finally managed, his voice tight. "No," I said. "It's a co-owner visiting his property to inform the other owners of a legal change. Perfectly within my rights." I let my gaze sweep over the crowd one last time, then settled it back on him. "And Grayson? You haven't seen anything yet." I left them standing there, Vivian's jaw set like stone, Grayson's face flushed, Nora frozen in place, as the cars began to file out, leaving the lawn emptier with every minute. The lake beyond glittered, untouched, mine again in all the ways that mattered. 3 weeks after the barbecue, the lake was quiet again. The parade of guests stopped coming. The laughter from the porch gone. I'd heard through the grapevine, mostly from Pete's diner, that Vivian and Charles had gone back to Chicago, leaving Nora and Grayson to reassess their investment. What they didn't say, but what I knew, was that the bills had started piling up. The property tax notice had arrived at their condo, along with late fees. Without dock access, they couldn't rent out the place to cover expenses. And the neighbors, now fully aware of what had happened, had stopped inviting them to community events, stopped waving from their boats. Around here, losing the lake's goodwill is like losing the lake itself. One afternoon, I saw Grayson loading boxes into his SUV. He didn't acknowledge me, and I didn't feel the need to gloat. Vivian was inside, no doubt making calls to find a buyer for the house they could no longer enjoy. Nora emerged last, her eyes lingering on the hydrangeas we'd planted together. She didn't say a word, but I saw her slip one bloom into her bag before getting into the car. By the end of the month, they were gone. I walked through the main house that first morning after they left. It smelled faintly of their perfume and cologne, but underneath that was the familiar scent of cedar and lake air. In the kitchen, I set the photo of 10-year-old Nora back on the entryway table, the trout in her hands, smiling lopsidedly at the camera. I didn't lock the door behind me. I didn't need to. The dock lot, the guest house, the main house, they were all mine again. Not in the way they had been before, perhaps, but in the way that mattered. The air felt lighter. The lake looked like it was breathing again. That evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, the same way I had 1,000 times before. The sun dipped low, turning the water gold, and I could almost hear her younger voice counting 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, before the thunder rolled in. For the first time in a long while, I let myself smile at the memory without the weight of what came after. People think revenge is about payback, about winning. They're wrong. It's about balance. It's about making sure the scales don't stay tipped in the wrong direction forever. What I did wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. But it was fair. They took without asking, without respect. And the lake has a way of giving back exactly what you put into it. Respect isn't something you inherit. It isn't owed because of blood or a name on a deed. It's earned, moment by moment, choice by choice. And when you spend years taking it for granted, the day will come when you find yourself on the wrong side of the dock, looking in. The cicadas began their evening chorus, and the water lapped gently against the pilings. I leaned back, letting the sound settle into my bones. The fight was over. The house was quiet, and for the first time in months, so was I. Thanks for spending this time with me and hearing my story. If it struck a chord with you, or if you've ever faced something similar in your own family, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories matter, and sharing them helps others feel less alone. Don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next story. Until then, take care of yourselves, stand your ground when it matters, and I'll see you in the next one.